Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Yo voy a hablar en inglés. Hablo un poco de español, pero como le he dicho a sus colegas aquí, soy sueca, pero incluso en sueco esto me parece muy difícil discutir. Mi trabajo es siempre en inglés y cuando voy a Suecia para presentar mi trabajo me siento tontísima, pero porque no llego a explicarlo en sueco, así que en español nada. Lo siento. So I am here today to talk to you about the work that the European Commission is doing on the work on sustainable buildings, which goes beyond energy efficiency. We have other colleagues in another part of the Commission, which is working on energy efficiency specifically. So if you at the end of the day have questions on that in particular, I can try to answer, but it's more likely that I will take them with me home. But I will be talking about resource efficiency opportunities in the building sector. So why is this important? Well, the resource consumption throughout the full life cycle of a building is quite substantial, to say the least. ¿Soy yo o no? Vale. We see here some figures which are quite impressive. Half of our extracted material goes to the building sector or to the construction sector. Half of our energy consumption, if we look at the full life cycle of the building, so not just the use phase, but looking at the whole cycle of the building. A third of our water consumption is directly related to the buildings. And actually, as much as a third of our total generated waste is construction and demolition waste. So quite some resource use to look at, and all this of course gives rise to environmental impacts. So it's not a sector which we can sort of say, it doesn't really matter. It has a clear impact. Why do we feel that the Commission in the first place have to look at this? Isn't the market taking care of this by itself? Well, we have seen that there are some clear barriers. There is no real common European understanding about what a green building is. If I ask you what is a green building, well, maybe you are very informed and know much more than most people, but most people would say, well, it is an energy efficient building. And they don't think so much about other things. Now, some people will say that it contains more aspects than the energy efficiency, but that what is more will typically vary depending on who you ask. And it will certainly vary on how they sort of define it, and even more so if you ask them how to measure it or assess it or whatever. So there is no such common understanding. And if that is the case, there is obviously a lack of reliable and comparable and certainly affordable data, which then links to methods and tools on how to assess or measure this. And that in turn obviously leads to the fact that there is no real guidance on how to incorporate environmental considerations into well, any kind of decision making, I would say, in the building sector, and definitely not in the purchasing decision either, when it comes to the investors and valuers and so on. Hence, the objective of our work is to try to influence this decision making along the life cycle by providing a tool that can result in relevant and comparable information regarding this environmental performance. And for that reason, we are together with large groups of stakeholders, we are developing an assessment framework with core indicators which could function as a common language for the mainstream market. Now you may say, well, there are already certification schemes out there, so why is this thing needed? And that is true, and we are working closely together with those certification schemes. But they are typically targeting relatively high end of the market, so offices, hotels, other buildings as well, obviously, but and they are particularly big in certain geographic areas as well. But when it comes to, for example, residential market, which is 70% of our buildings in Europe, or generally the mainstream market, there is not much of environmental performance assessment going on. We have estimated that less than 0.5% of our buildings in Europe have been assessed beyond energy efficiency aspects. So the benefit with our framework, and I will tell you more about what that would look like, probably, is that we see that as a possibility to have a common language, and that in turn then would allow some transparency between different actors on the market or different building projects and so on. And it would also help us to build up reliable and comparable data, as I've been saying 3 or 4 times now, how important we think that is. We all know that the business case starts with having good data, so that's why we think it is very important. We also believe that it would make it easier to have an effective transfer of better and best practices between companies, building projects, member states, etc. Now, why do I put in better practices? Well, the thing is, of course, that we are not particularly targeting the best performers here. If they want to use our framework in the end, we will be very happy. But the main objective for us is to try to reach the mainstream market and improve them a bit, or make them aware of the resources that they're using and what impact that can have. And depending on choices that they make along a building project, how they can actually impact the use of resources and have an impact on the environmental performance in the end. Now, we are not expecting suddenly the mainstream market to become BREEAM outstanding or something like that, all of them, but to sort of wake up the awareness and bit by bit improve the performance. That's what we are looking to do. Hence, I'm talking about better practices as opposed to necessarily best practice. I wanted to jump to a couple of recent reports that I've read, which I think are very interesting, and which I think obviously sort of confirm that the work that we are doing is on the right track. So one is a very recent report from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They concluded in a very recent report that the industry can only improve on what it measures. Not surprising. And until we understand the entire life cycle impacts of our built assets, we cannot holistically address the environmental consequences of the spaces that we inhabit. Well, it's a bit of a heavy sentence maybe, but obviously it sort of it states the obvious, that if we don't know what we're doing, we can't impact it. And that is where we feel that this framework of core indicators, which I will show you a bit later what it will look like, we think could have a role to play. The same report goes on to say that it's clear that energy is no longer the single focus of what defines a sustainable building. And in order to avoid burden shifting, that is that you focus all your attention to one particular part of the building, one particular resource use in the building in a particular life cycle stage. If you do that, you risk to make something else worse. That is the burden shifting, yeah. So my example then would be that if you look only at energy efficiency, I'm not saying energy efficiency is important; it's very important. But when you focus on that, you need to focus on other aspects as well, so that they don't get worse. Yeah. So this report then sort of reminds us to avoid burden shifting, we need to look at several environmental life cycle indicators, and that is obviously what we are trying to do in our work. So they ask for a robust and common indicator language, that it should be simple to use and to communicate, and that we should work with a limited selection of indicator categories in order to make that relatively simplicity available, so to say. Another report from the World Green Building Trends 2016. They have looked at the green building market both globally but also in Europe specifically. And in Europe, they've seen that the percentage of firms that have done more than 60% green projects in 2015 was 18%. And the forecast for 2018 from those companies is 30%. If we look at the numbers back in 2012 and 2008, already those 18% today is a huge step up. Now, this is, of course, not all building projects in Europe. This reflects the answers of the respondents to this survey, but it is a huge survey. We can also see at the same time that companies which are not foreseeing any green involvement in the next couple of years, they are strongly decreasing. So that goes down. The main triggering factor for this change, because it is a change, is really the client demand. And also, to a certain extent, environmental regulation, but very much client demand. That is becoming more and more important as a driver to work for the green building market. While doing the right thing as a driver, which was very important a couple of years ago, it was the biggest one a few years ago only, is becoming less relevant. So we see there is a change in drivers as well, which is interesting, I think. Now, the European Commission, as I said, we are working with stakeholders to develop a framework of core indicators, which should be simple at the same time, hence simple in the sense not too many indicators. It should really be possible for most companies who are interested to use the indicators. At the same time, of course, it should be comprehensive enough so that we don't risk burden shifting, for example. About 1 year ago, we, together with the stakeholders, we agreed on what kind of macro objectives we thought that the sector should have in relation to this framework then. What would be the key aspects that the sector should work towards, which we then later on would link indicators to. And these are the 6 ones. So greenhouse gases from life cycle energy use. So be aware of the life cycle energy use there. Yeah. So it's not just the energy efficiency of the building, but it's also energy used in other parts of the cycle. Resource efficient material life cycles. That's a difficult one. It can mean a lot of things, but it's basically how can we be more efficient with the material use. Yeah. Efficient use of water resources. Healthy and comfortable spaces, which I think we will hear more about in a bit. Resilience to climate change, and optimized life cycle cost and value. So the first 3 ones are really very much focusing on resource use, right? Energy, material, and water. While the last 3 ones are more about the quality of the building and the value of the building. So we're trying, as you see, to have a mix. Once we had those macro objectives, which I said were ready about 1 year ago, we spent spring this year, spring 2016, to do a broad scoping exercise to identify indicators which have been used in one way or the other, mainly in Europe, but also elsewhere, which sort of link to those macro objectives. And we wanted to see how have they worked? If someone has used an indicator, has it worked well or not? Why? What can we learn from that? Is it something that we could propose or not? So we looked at all kinds of initiatives. You see them listed here. I won't go through them all, but really we looked at public sector initiatives. We looked at permitting and planning requirements. We looked at, of course, existing assessment schemes, certification schemes. We looked at technical studies and standards in that sense, harmonization initiatives. I don't know if you're aware of Sustainable Building Alliance, which has already tried to look at what is BREEAM doing, HQE, DGNB, and so on, to try them to come together at parts. So yeah, we looked at all kinds of aspects. Green public procurement, of course, what has been used, what has worked, and how does it link to those macro objectives that we had put up initially. So once we had concluded on what kind of indicators we wanted to propose to the public, we ran a public consultation. It started in July last summer, and it ran until very recently. It was closed in October, and it was, I admit, quite a technical consultation, because we were really discussing indicators, and we were discussing also how the framework could be used. yes, so the questions were quite technical. So the fact that we had, I think, 120 responses was something we thought were very good. And we also know for a fact that many of those responses cover or reflect, I should say, a lot of discussions within organizations, and big organizations send in one response. I don't know if anyone here has been involved at all in discussing this public consultation, but just to say that we now have some results from that, which we think are very interesting, and we will be discussing them very soon. So anyway, we had all kinds of respondents to this public consultation, contractors and supply chain, of course, design team members of all sorts, assessment schemes, very important for us to hear their views as well. All kinds of, both on the supply side, but also on the demand side, the client side. It's very important for us when we are developing this, that we hear the voices of the investors and the property valuers and so on, because if they are not interested in it, it won't take off, obviously. I mean, you know that better than I do, who work in the business. So we really try to include them in this discussion as well. So we had feedback, as I said, on both the suggested indicators, but also on horizontal matters, on how we would actually use it and how we could, how we could work with it and how we could encourage people to use it and so on and so forth. So I thought I would share with you some general outcomes from this public consultation. I should say that next week, on Wednesday, we have a major meeting in Brussels for those stakeholder groups that we have worked closely with when we have developed this work. So we will then present the more detailed results of the public consultation, and we will discuss with them, and we hopefully could get to some agreement based on that discussion. But I thought I would share with you some general outcomes from it, so that you get a flavor of what I'm actually talking about. Actually, I think I'm going to start with another slide. Here, I start with this one. So the most popular indicators from the public consultation then were the following ones. So operational and embodied energy together were seen as very important. So that would mean obviously the energy that has gone into the building before it's used at all, and then the use phase. And then cradle to grave life cycle analysis. That was maybe a little bit surprising to us, because we thought that, we knew that some stakeholders are very keen on including this more than what is happening today. But we also thought that many would be a bit more cautious about it, because of course we know that it requires an effort, at least initially, to set it up, so to say. But it came out as something which many people felt very strongly about, actually. Then construction and demolition waste. That was less surprising, I would say, and obviously also the hazardous part of the construction and demolition waste. The mains drinking water came out high as well. Obviously that depends on also which part of Europe you're in, but in general that is considered something that should be looked at. When it comes to healthy and comfortable spaces, which was one of those macro objectives that I mentioned before, we have focused this work now on indoor air quality. There are of course many aspects of healthy and comfortable spaces, but as we wanted to sort of take it easy and not come with 25 indicators, we wanted to keep it simple to start with. We decided that we would focus on indoor air quality, and hence the most important indicator in that respect then is linked to the airborne pollutant levels. When it comes to the macro objective of climate change, resilience to climate change, we have focused on the risk of overheating and the additional cooling energy that is required for that. And that came up as very high as well. Again, obviously, slightly depending on where in Europe you are, but in general it was seen as important. And then the last part is the life cycle costing, which would include acquisition, maintenance and utility. And obviously that is something which is very important for certain stakeholders, but those stakeholders are very important to get this machine to roll, so to say, so that comes up as well. So if I go back now, yeah. So those were the indicators that came up high on the list. We also got a response saying on the more general questions, horizontal questions, that it should indeed be a mix of sort of standard indicators and more advanced ones. I mean, for example, the LCA one, clearly the life cycle analysis one, is clearly something which would require more to use. But the answers were quite clear in the public consultation that some of those indicators should actually require greater expertise, so that we could encourage market leaders. And it also came out that the framework should be able to support comparison, primarily at the national level and project level, obviously, between one project and another, mainly in the same country, because different countries have different building cultures, they have different materials maybe that they use, different climates and so on. But it should also be possible to use if wished for at the European level. Obviously, data used as input to calculate those indicators can be a very different level and hence quality. So what I mean is that if you have not worked much with LCA before, you may want to work with some kind of general industry data which is available. If you want to improve the quality of your data a bit, you could, if you have the possibility, you could use regionalized data. That is data which is it's sort of standard industry data, but for the country or for the region where you're working. So that would be one way of improving the quality of the data. And of course, the best data you would have if you didn't, if you had data specifically from your process, that would be, and then you would have really good quality probably of your data. But we don't expect everyone to have that fantastically good quality from the beginning. So you can have data used as input of different level, and for the sake of transparency then, the users should report on the data sources and hence the quality, so that the one who then sort of picks up the results of a building project's indicators can judge, okay, how good is this data, and how much can I trust it when I, for example, value the building then. It also became very clear that most respondents were keen on having, looking at the performance of the building, both at the design stage, but also at the post-occupant stage, and that it was very important to include the potential for occupant surveys. And I think, again, we will hear more about that later. So basically, it would be good if we could use indicators that could be monitored throughout a building's lifetime, the same kind of indicator, to also see if there is a big difference between what the building was designed for and what it actually turned out to be. Okay. There were some aspects which came out as very important, but which were not seen as probably useful to use as indicators, but still very important to keep in mind. So we will probably include that somehow in the guidelines that we will prepare for the framework. That's, for example, service life projection. How long is the building supposed to stand for? Design for adaptability. How adaptable is the building, which also, of course, will have an impact on the service life then. And design for disassembly as opposed to demolition at the end of the life of the building. How do you take that into account at the design stage? I realize I think I've missed to put in the most important slide here, and I apologize for that. But that would be to make very clear to you that what we are thinking of is a reporting tool between stakeholders, so that they can report on those indicators between each other on a voluntary basis. So you can all relax. A voluntary basis, a reporting tool. We also hope, but that remains to be seen, but we hope that the bigger certification schemes, well, that existing and maybe future certification schemes will use these indicators, this framework of indicators, as a module in their schemes, next to their larger set of indicators, so that they, between themselves, would be comparable on those indicators. Now, obviously, that depends on if they are happy with what we, of the result that we come up with. But they are working closely with us on this, and the idea of having it as a module in their schemes was something that they suggested themselves a number of years ago. So fingers crossed that we can get to that as well. So I said a reporting tool. I said module in existing schemes. I said voluntary. We hope that it will be used by public authorities in green public procurement. So that is what it is. What it is not, or what the framework should not be used for, we are not intending to, set up a European certification scheme with a European logo saying European Green Building or something like that. No, that we wouldn't. Well, there's no need for it, I think, because there are already fantastic certification schemes around, and plus there are we wouldn't have the resources to do so in no way. So that it will not be. And obviously also we will not attach European benchmarks to it. So if we suggest an indicator of embodied energy, for example, we don't expect to link European benchmark to that. We would be very happy if companies themselves, after a while, started to internally set some objectives for it. We would be also very happy if in green public procurement, some member states started to attach benchmarks to it, but we will not do it at a European level. So the next steps for us is really to, as I said, on Wednesday, we will have this bigger working group meeting in Brussels, looking more carefully at the results of the public consultation, have discussions, and hopefully be able to draw some conclusions on that. We will draft guidelines for the indicators on how to use them and the methodologies for how you assess them and so on and measure them next spring. And we will finalize the framework. So I take it it's not me, actually. We will finalize this framework by next summer. And then present it to the world. Yes, that's that. Thank you. Maybe I can just say, maybe I can just say that we understand, of course, that it's not enough to just develop this framework and then sort of put it on a website somewhere and then hope that everything is going to be fine. We are starting to work together with different stakeholders as well on discussing on how can we encourage the implementation of this, even if it is a voluntary tool, how can we push this forward, how can we help with, and how can they help us with testing, demonstration of the scheme and seeing that it actually works or not, so how can we fine-tune it, could we link funding to it, etc. So that's something that we're looking at as well.